Hey everybody, welcome to the Elmwood Midweek Bible Podcast, where our goal is to help you understand your Bibles and show you how they point to Jesus. I'm Matt, your host. I'm excited to be here with you, and I have a guest here, Zach Melvin. Say hi, Zach.
Hey Matt, it's great to be here today.
Yeah, good to have you.
Yeah.
And I am just so excited to get into this next section. We have finished going through the Old Testament context in our course, People, Places, and Things. And now we're moving on to the next section of the course where we're considering the New Testament context. And similarly to how we did it with the Old Testament, we're going to be having the same categories. And the first category we're looking at is the history and the geography of the New Testament. Now, just like we did with the Old Testament, we just kind of big picture overviewed what is the context of the Old Testament. And in that context, we talked about it was the ancient Near East over thousands of years, but certainly an ancient Near Eastern culture. And as we get into the New Testament, we are coming into a pretty different scenario here where we pass on from this ancient Near Eastern setting to what we would call like the first century Greco-Roman period. Some of us call this Second Temple Judaism. Zach, Second Temple Judaism is kind of a fancy word, and I would love to just kind of pin it down, like exactly what that means. Could you kind of give us a little bit of background on that?
Yeah, so Second Temple Judaism would be the time that the Second Temple was built near 586 BC when the Jews returned to the land. And that would last all the way up until 70 AD when the Romans came and destroyed that temple.
Yeah, so that's good. So it's literally the time. It's literally the time that the Second Temple was standing, if you think of it like that. I know it sounds like a fancy thing, but it's literally that time, and we need to think about it, you know? So that kind of gives us an idea of like the time period we are looking at. Now, you know, as we think about the transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament, there are, you know, hundreds of years in between the ending of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew. And those years are not arbitrary. Like, they're very formative on the Jewish people. And it really sets up a situation where Jesus coming is this unique and perfect scenario. So I'd love if you could just kind of give us a little bit of like a big picture overview. Like, you know, when you and I were talking about it, it's like, it's this kind of amazing story over 400 years of like what was happening and how it set up the scenario for Jesus coming. So could you kind of give us a run through of some of that time period from Malachi to Matthew?
Yeah, so this is a time where the Jews have returned, but they're not really all there. They have this physical return to the land, but they still feel this spiritual exile. The Persians had conquered Babylon, and the Jews have been sent back, but it just wasn't the same. This would introduce the Greek period, which came over around 332 BC when Alexander the Great comes in, and he really reshaped everything that Jews were thinking about the world. He introduced Hellenization, which we'll touch on in a little bit. After he dies in 323 BC, he divides up his generals and founds the Ptolemies in Egypt, Seleucids in Syria, and these will kind of try to control Israel for over 100 years and go against one another. In 198 BC, the Seleucids take control, and Antiochus Epiphanes IV rules from the start of 175 BC. He was nuts. He just even tried to impose Hellenization himself. He desecrated the temple in 164 BC, leading to a revolt by the Jewish people for 24 years. This would result in Jewish independence of Judah. And actually, this is where Hanukkah comes from, which you actually probably have read about in John chapter 10. This is the Feast of Dedication, where Jesus comes in the winter and he talks about himself being the Good Shepherd. After this time, there's the Hasmonean period. It's focused on the Mattathias family. This is where Jews had autonomy. After this, Rome comes to power, and after a 3-month siege of the temple area, Pompey takes Jerusalem in 63 BC, and goes into the most holy place, and leaves a bad taste for Rome.
kind of a crazy scenario.
Right.
Man, so it sounds like there is a lot of just kind of turbulence over a period of 400 years for the Jewish people especially. Do you feel like, as you think about this, Zach, that this kind of set up the scenario for Jesus coming?
I think so in a lot of ways. Just really having even the spiritual tension that the Jews felt, just their homeland, their own temple being desecrated. That really did set it up for the time that Jesus would come in.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thanks for walking us through that. As we think kind of about this, I also want to highlight just a few other points, because we think about, okay, that's the period leading up to Jesus coming, but what's the scenario like right at the time that God takes on flesh in Jesus? Like, what is that situation like? And I think to do that, we have to go back just a little bit, because we have to remember, during the time of Pompey, this is also kind of the time of a person that a lot of us are familiar with, Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar was kind of a visionary, if you will, for his time. He also was a little bit, I would imagine, like a bull in a china shop, in the sense of like he made some friends. He also made a good amount of enemies, and he kind of helped Rome transition from a republic to a little bit more of like a monarchical situation, where he may not officially have been the monarch. He never was officially called emperor, but functionally in some ways. And it led to some people being upset. They killed him. And the result of that is eventually he is divinized. So he's like the divine Julius. And after a little bit of struggle, Octavian, who's his heir and his adopted son, actually comes into power after battling with Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And he comes into power. And so that practically makes him Divi Filius, as they called him, the son of God, which is very interesting, that you've got this scenario where you've got Octavian, now called Augustus by that time, who's ruling as emperor. And at the same time, you have God stepping in, coming in the flesh as the true Son of God. And so there's really some like historical circles that are coming together. It's really interesting as you think about some of this, of like, when Pompey, in some reading, like Pompey goes into the most holy place, and in other temples and other cultures, they would have had an image in the temple. And what they find is the Jews didn't have an image. And so he's like kind of confused by this scenario. But even as we're thinking about, okay, what's the time of Jesus? Who's around? What's going on? Well, I think one of the things to note is Herod the Great, who's an Idumean. He is the most powerful Jewish monarch of the entire period, and he is ruling over Judea when Jesus is born. And Jesus is born, and you have the Magi that show up, and they say, tell us we're the King of the Jews. We've seen his star, and we've come to worship him. And it's funny because Rome, through a series of circumstances, had given Herod the title King of the Jews. Mm-hmm. And so there's this real dynamic where he's feeling threatened by the situation. And Herod's crazy. He doesn't want to lose his power. He kills 3 of his sons. He kills one of his favorite wives. And it's just this real scenario, this fight for power, wanting to have it.
Yeah, in the biblical picture, like you're saying, totally accords with what we know from history. Just wanting to kill babies under 2 years old. I mean, what kind of person would have that in their hearts and mindset to do that?
Right.
So,
but he's willing to kill the babies over losing his title of King of the Jews.
Right.
So it's this real tragic scenario. And eventually he's replaced by a number of his sons in different territories, but one of them is Archelaus, who ruled from 4 BC to 6 AD. And Archelaus was even more crazy than his dad, so crazy that Rome actually deposed of him, and he was replaced by kind of a distant Roman governorship that eventually, after a revolt by a guy named Judas the Galilean, Rome made Judea its own province, and under prefects and procurators. So Pontius Pilate was one of those more direct leaders who took control in AD 26, who we are familiar with from the Passion narratives with Jesus.
Right.
Eventually, Agrippa I, he's the grandson of Herod, is made king over the territory. Then it goes back to more direct Roman rule for different procurators, and they really do not rule well up until the point in AD 66. So this is after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension. where a guy named Eliezer, he's the captain of the temple, and related to the high priest, he convinces some priests to stop sacrificing daily to the emperor. And when they do that, it's not just, okay, you're not sacrificing. It was more of a revolt. It was more of a declaration where we are no longer allied with you. And it kind of sparked a war, essentially. And it gets kind of crazy. And eventually, a guy named Titus is sent to put this revolt down. And eventually, his dad, Vespasian, becomes emperor after Nero, the present emperor, commits suicide in AD 68. And Titus is left to try and end this siege in Jerusalem, which he does in AD 70 when he finally destroys the temple, lays siege to Jerusalem. And at that point, the second temple period ends. Now, there's a whole lot of history that happens even after that as the Jewish people are trying to find identity and what to do in light of all of that. But we don't have time to go into that on this podcast. But is there anything you want to add to some of that, Zach?
Yeah, even backtracking to the time that Titus destroyed the temple, Josephus records what this looked like, and it was horrible beyond belief. People even committing cannibalism during this time. And we don't see it now, but Jews at the time, again, the theme being tension here, this just adds on an extra layer of just horror.
We think about kind of, some of the history. We've touched on a little bit of that, but I think one of the things that we need to consider then is where this happened. Right? There's a situation that when we were in the Old Testament period, we talked about this kind of area as Syro-Palestine, right? It was a specific area on the map. And now certainly when the apostles go out into the rest of the Mediterranean world, there's more to focus on than what we're going to have time to look at today. But I want to focus on that kind of Palestinian area there. And we want to break it down into 3 sections. So Zach, could you kind of walk us through some of those 3 sections? And I'm happy to add in wherever you would like.
Yeah, so the first main section that we can focus on is Galilee. This is to the north. It's a fertile region. We think of Jews wanting to live there, but there's actually Greeks and Romans wanting to live there as well. The next section we can move on to is Samaria. So this is a place that had the legacy of the Old Testament northern kingdom. It was actually the capital. After the exile, foreigners come in and they make this place their home. They mix with the remaining residents there. The Jews took control of this place during the intertestamental period. Rome actually came in later on and freed Samaria from the control of the Jews. They have some religious differences as well as some similarities with the Jewish people. The final section we can move on to would be Judea, Jerusalem. This is the hotbed of religious life. It was seen as just a hub of this religion. Yet not everybody loved Jerusalem, surprisingly. Because of the Sadducees there especially, they were seen, the Sadducees, as corrupt, this aristocratic group, just like really high class and wealthy, rich, friends of Rome, so traitors in a sense. There's also a lot of Hellenization that had come in there, which we'll touch on in a little bit. And that just made some people view Jerusalem with some disdain.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I know when we were talking about this, you had mentioned, and it had just kind of come up, that the passage with Jesus and the Samaritan woman, as we think about Samaria, it's generally a place of hostility towards the Jewish people and vice versa, to the point where I know, like, during the first century, like, the Samaritans came in and, like, put some corpses in the temple, and they were thoroughly barred from coming into the temple from that point forward.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the right response to that.
Right, and so there's definitely like a weird tension. But Jesus seems to have a little bit of a different approach. Do you want to kind of just walk us through just a little bit of that passage from John 4?
Yeah, so a lot of us are familiar with the story of, John 4, where Jesus comes to the woman at the well. She's surprised to see him there. He's not too surprised because he knows why he's come. And one line that kind of sets straight our understanding of the relationship between them. She says, "Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." And this was the view of the Jews at the time, understandably, that Jerusalem is where they would worship God. Jesus says to her, Believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father.
So there's a real dynamic there of tension that Jesus, it's kind of this amazing moment that he actually goes into Samaria. As we kind of finish things up here, I think we want to think about some of the implications of this. We've talked about the history, we've talked about the geography, but there are, there's kind of some things that I think are worth highlighting that kind of resulted out of this period that are really impactful for the way that we understand the New Testament as we enter into it, that are good to have in the back of our head. So let's walk through these kind of one at a time. The first one here that I've written down is Hellenization, and that's a really interesting word. Could you tell us kind of what that means and a little bit of the history behind that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so even in studying this myself, actually, I looked at Hellenization and I said, what does that word even mean? You think of maybe Helen of Troy as possibly where this is coming from. It's actually, another way to say it would be a Greekanization, if you really want to botch it. It's making things Greek, from the language to the culture to the customs to everything in there. And what's really key to see is Alexander the Great as being the fountainhead of this Hellenization. He was born at 356 BC. He dies in 323 BC, but in this time, he's tutored by Aristotle. He knows Greek philosophy through and through. Everywhere he went, he would impose this Greek culture. It wasn't fluid; it was different depending on the area, but overall, it was a spread of these ideas and this language and this way of thinking as well.
That's really interesting. Just even thinking about I don't think we can tangibly understand actually.
Right.
How powerful that Greek force was as it swept through the ancient world. For as short as Alexander's life was, he was a force, and with him just came this huge Greek culture. And like you said, they were brilliant. They kind of made it such that Greek culture could coexist with people's culture. So it wasn't like you were trying to displace me. It was almost like this weird form of befriending my culture and at the same time integrating yourself within it.
Right.
And so there's a few ways that I think that they did this. Do you could you give us a rundown? There's a few ways I know that they really Hellenized the culture. What are some of those categories?
Yeah, for sure. So probably the main three ways that this culture was spread was through a language. So you can think of even the New Testament Greek that we have with Koine Greek. That's not where it started. That's probably a more, street language version of Greek. We have the polis, which just means city in Greek. That would just be making different cities. Alexandria being a really big one that Alexander himself made. And the last thing being religious syncretism. So just trying to mix two different religions together is what it means. They're just mixing these different religious ideas together into one.
That's super interesting. And I imagine as that happened, they really had to find out, the Jewish community specifically, as Greek culture just sweeps in, they're having to find ways to live within this culture. How crazy. What a scenario, to the point where there's Jewish people that aren't regularly speaking Hebrew. Yeah. And now you're or I guess in this context, it would have been, many of them would have been Aramaic, and Hebrew is more of a liturgical language for some. So it's really interesting to think about. And as we think about kind of the result of that, I imagine that would have impacted their kind of literary context and culture.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about how Hellenization would have impacted them from a literary perspective?
Yeah, so probably the main way would be the Septuagint, which this was their Bible at certain points. Close to the time of Jesus being born, in a lot of cases, that's all they could read was the Koine Greek Septuagint. There's parts of the Apocrypha written before this in Hebrew, but it was really assimilated into the Septuagint itself through translation, through dissemination, just going out. And just an example I could share from that would be the fourth Maccabees. So there's actually 4 different volumes of Maccabees written, and this is the last one. It tries to blend kind of Greek philosophy with traditional Jewish thinking. And fourth Maccabees actually starts probably the headiest thing we can think of. He says, "The subject that I am about to discuss is most philosophical. That is, whether devout reason is sovereign over the emotions. So it is right for me to advise you to pay earnest attention to philosophy." So you can see right here, they're already not just taking the language, but trying to take Greek philosophy into account in the ways they think. At the same time, in the very same book, it ends with these words. It says, "Oh, bitter was that day, and yet not bitter, when that bitter tyrant of the Greeks quenched fire with fire in his cruel cauldrons, and in his burning rage brought those 7 sons of the daughter of Abraham to the catapult and back again to more tortures." That tyrant of the Greeks that we might even call great was Alexander the Great. So there's a tension again between they see Alexander as just this tyrant coming in. He just runs over different cultures, different people, including their own, even though they were included within the empire. At the same time, they have to give credit to him introducing actually a lot of these Greek philosophies and ways of thinking that they try to bring into their language. So
there's a real dynamic there that exists between the Jewish world is Hellenized, essentially. Yes. Many of them begin to speak Greek. You've got this literature going on during the intertestamental period, and that is kind of absorbed into the Greek Old Testament manuscripts. So they're reading this religious literature that we call the Apocrypha, which apparently the evidence we have says the Jews didn't think it was inspired, but they did think it was important. And then on the other hand, we also have, along with that, we have them reading their Hebrew Bibles, but in a Greek translation. And we're just seeing this kind of coming together of Jewish thinking, religious practice. I wouldn't say religious practice, Jewish thinking, right, and kind of culture with the influence of Greek. Is that what you're saying?
That's totally what I'm getting at. And I think that's what a lot of scholars would even think of this area or this time period, is that they're trying to do that to varying degrees.
It's very interesting, enormously interesting. Well, our final kind of implication of this, as we think about geography especially, is what we call the diaspora. So Zach, as you think about the diaspora, what is that, and what's the value of that for us to have understanding?
Yeah, so in the simplest terms, we could think of a diaspora as just the time of exile for the Jews. They're 80% of Jews are living outside of the Promised Land. You still have the 20% that are living in the Promised Land, which we would think of as like Jerusalem, what was formerly Canaan, turned Israel. But at the same time, it's a dispersion with the Jews living in various places. That dispersion was caused by various factors. We have the forced migration with different circumstances that could be whether through wars, through just job security, trying to find a way to make a living for the family. And the major concentration of this diaspora was actually in Alexandria, which again, we said before, was founded by Alexander the Great. Syrian Antioch was another city, and Rome were the main concentrations of these Jews.
When we get to the New Testament, we find that history is, I would say, perfectly set up so that when Jesus shows up, he is stepping into a scenario where he's the true Son of God, the true King who has come to fight on behalf of his people and give them a new identity in him, one that is not grounded in anything that we can find in this world, but in what he has done for them. And so I think there's some really beautiful stuff to be found there. But as we wrap things up, is there any final things you want to just leave us with real quick?
Yeah, actually, following in on that of just what Jesus brought and what the Jews were looking for in a Messiah closer to his time. It's actually a really interesting part of the Apocrypha, and I'll parallel this with a section of Matthew as well. So if you read Sirach in the Apocrypha, chapter 51, verse 23, it says, Draw near to me, you who are uneducated, and lodge in the house of instruction. To jump down a few verses, it says, put your neck under her yoke and let your souls receive instruction. It is to be found close by. And some of you might be thinking, like, where have I heard this before? Like, this sounds so familiar with something I've heard from the Bible. And it is. Jesus talks in much the same way. In Matthew 11:28, he says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So even in the midst of this hopelessness, this was the hope they were looking for in Jesus in the midst of diaspora and turmoil and tension.
So we see that Jesus is right consistent with kind of the flow of history leading into his incarnation and his work. And he's not just like speaking something that was not digestible to them, but stuff that was, digestible in their context and speaking to real needs and hopes that they had. Now, they may not have kind of understood exactly what that had looked like sure. But there's a real situation there where he is the one they had been looking for, even if they didn't know it.
That's right.
So, no, that's so good. Well, let's wrap it up, Zach. Thank you for being on, for sharing that stuff with us. I really appreciate the work that you do, your heart for Jesus. I think you're a really capable teacher, and I think it's great that you're here. So we're thankful for you at Elmwood, and we're glad that you were able to join us for the podcast. For now, this is Matt signing off. I'm looking forward to getting into things with you next time as we look at the social context of the New Testament as well. So I'll be talking to you soon. Take care.